Welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you here and to have everyone online. Oh, dear Catherine Welsh is in the waiting room. Should we let her in? Yes. Remove. Admit. There we go. Welcome, Catherine. So welcome. It's wonderful to have you here, and we're really delighted to have Professor Giulia Sissa here. Giulia has been a guest at the Critical Antiquities workshop before, as featured speaker and as attendee in the audience, and it's been wonderful, but it's a great privilege to have her here in person. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the country on which we're gathering. We acknowledge the traditional custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand, since that we are on the University of Sydney today. We pay our respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country. And I'd like to introduce Giulia formally, and I'm going to keep this brief because I'd like to turn to the conversation, and we could spend a long time listing her accolades, and I don't want to detain you all too long. So let me do this as best as I can. So Giulia Sissa is Distinguished Professor in the Departments of Classics and Political Science at the University of California, Los Angeles. She was trained in France and in Italy and has held positions in Europe and also at Johns Hopkins in the US prior to the move to UCLA. While anchoring her research to the societies and the cultures of the Greek and Roman world, Giulia connects the study of the past to moments of reception, recontextualization, and significant resonance in the modern world. She also orients her interests in view of major contemporary issues such as feminism, sexuality, addiction, democratic theory, utopian thinking, political emotions, and eco-criticism. She has published many significant works, and her work has been translated into many different languages. So her publications include the first book, Madre Materia, published with Silvia Campese and Paola Manuli with Torino Boringhieri Press in 1983. Her famous work, Le Corps Virginal, which was translated into English as Greek Virginity in 1989 and into Italian as well. The wonderful book, La vie quotidienne de Dieu grec, with Marcel Detienne, published in 1989 and translated into Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Greek, Dutch, and English as The Daily Life of the Greek Gods. In 2000, and I could go on like this. There's a lot of text and lots of translation, so we're really so delighted to have Giulia here. But the text that we're really excited to talk about today in particular is her most recent book, which is Le Pouvoir de Femmes, published last year in Paris with Odile Jacob. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, and thank you so much for your time, Giulia.
I thank you. I thank Ben and Tristan and Francis and all of you here, and Dimitris, who is the first mover for this visit to Australia. I join my guests in acknowledging the custodian of country. Very interesting way of formulating it. And I delegate the first words actually to Ben, because this is a conversation. It has been presented as such to me. And therefore, you launch it.
It's the classics equivalent of a talk show. And we're going to talk about your new book.
Yes.
And we're going to fire off some questions for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then perhaps open up the floor. I might start first, though, just by providing some context. Giulia's amazing book, which I'm only just a little bit of the way through with my imperfect French, is an amazing book. But I thought I'd provide a little bit of context by just describing what the book, or how the book is organized. The book has a deceptively easy title to translate, Le Pouvoir de Femmes. It seems like it's going to announce its subject fairly straightforwardly, but in fact, there's there are question marks, right? So what Giulia does in the book is she begins in classical Athens, which is always a great place to begin, thinking about the gendered body in the Athenian democracy. And surprisingly, it starts out really being more about men than about women. But as it turns out, these two subjects are very much entwined. And about the formation of the male body within the context of this most classical of Greek cities, and particularly within the democracy. And this will raise some interesting questions about the relationship between democracy and the place of women in a democracy. Larger questions beyond classical Athens, I think, as we've discussed before. And then in chapter 2, Giulia turns to the always problematic Aristotle, and Aristotle's attempt to, shall we say, naturalize the incapacity of women to participate in political life, where Aristotle more or less defines woman as a kind of, is disabled. Is that would be correct, right? Yeah, as a sort of somehow congenitally sort of unable to participate in the life of the city and in deliberation. And Aristotle, of course, attempts to try and find a basis for this in the natural world, and codify it as a sort of scientific fact. Now, one of the interesting things in the book is at the very beginning, even in the preface, Giulia announces that the Greeks, however, already thought otherwise, or could think otherwise about the way, the kind of capacity that women might have within the city-state. And she turns in chapters 3 and 4 to explore these images of women, for want of a sort of better expression, women who can, right? Women who can, to play on this notion of pouvoir that you have in the title. Women who act with deliberation, with courage, with decisive action, and so on. For instance, the amazing Artemisia of Halicarnassus, one of Xerxes' admirals, and some of the queens and mothers of Euripidean tragedy. And where she explores the place of women. I suppose in chapter 3, the place of women that women could have in war, which is always a field which is marked off as exclusively masculine, and then the kind of political advice that women might be able to offer within the framework of the democratic city, within the genre of tragedy. Then in chapter 5, Giulia's book turns to the way in which medieval Christian thought receives the Aristotelian scientific definition of the incapacity of women, and how the work of figures like Aquinas codify into Catholicism this Aristotelian notion of the deficiency of women. And then finally, in chapter 6, you sound a very optimistic note, perhaps, because you turn to these remarkable figures in the Enlightenment, Poulain de la Barre and Condorcet, who, without really signaling it, they turn around and they offer a case for the admission of women into public life on a remarkably humanistic basis. And so what I'm going to do is if we've got enough time, we'll sort of work through all of these amazing examples, and maybe we will digress and detour down some of these pathways. But I want to just ask Giulia straight off, in an email exchange that we had, you said that the publisher rejected the first title of the book, which is the title that I've given this session, which is Que peuvent la femme? What can women do, I suppose, is one way we translate that, right? Why did the publisher reject that title, do you think?
Thank you for this first question. Well, Odile Jacob is a very powerful woman, and so, I mean, she has the last word on her titles, and she wanted a matter-of-fact title, and I obliged. Of course, what I had in mind was a sort of echo of que veulent les femmes, what do women want? So, you know, Freud is always a bit in the background for me. And I wanted precisely to move the question mark from what do we want to what can we and what can we do. But I would say I would go even more into the being there of women as a human being in the world. What can we be? So for me, the semantic puzzle or challenging starting point was to talk about power, possibility, potential, and trying to see how in ancient culture this chain of thought of power, possibility, and potential just come into existence in the language, in the thought, and in particular in the thinking of Aristotle. And why I was interested in this sort of semantic ramified field, because I think that there we have a knot, if you want, or a synergy, a convergency of ideas and argumentations that really do the trick of crippling women in a way that is perhaps the most effective and the most durable, because that particular crippling of the feminine, of female subjectivity, agency, possibility, potentiality, and power has gone on, well, it's still there, actually, in certain places in our world. The Catholic Church still doesn't admit women as priests, and if we look at the argumentations, we feel absolutely at home, because via Thomas Aquinas, we are always with our friend Aristotle, and we are precisely at the core of this articulation, semantic articulation, power, possibility, potentiality, because what's really wrong with women, to cut to the chase, for Aristotle, whom I read as the anthropologist of Greek culture, what is really wrong with women is their incapacity to make decisions. So the problem is, as we learn from Politics 1, the bouleutikon, to bouleutikon, the deliberative faculty. Women have this faculty as opposed to slaves who have not at all the deliberative faculty. Women have it, but it is akuron. But it is, as we usually understand and translate, without authority. And this description, this qualification of the deliberative faculty of women is an argument, an idea, a train of thought that I think we can understand best in the Nicomachean Ethics, when while discussing what a decision-making process is, Aristotle tells us that a proairesis is precisely a sequence of judgments, of a form of intelligence and understanding, but at some point we have to resolve the problem. We have to decide, we have to determine what to do. And at that point, there is something in us, or I should say in them, for Aristotle, there is a woman on, which is really what does the proairesis. And that is comparable to a Homeric king, he says. The Homeric king in the past, at some point, would announce to the people what they had decided and what should be done. So this metaphor, this simile metaphor, we can discuss about that, for me is a paradigm, is a model, is really a key to understand the implication of power, possibility, authority, responsibility that in the politics is precisely lacking in women. So that passage of the Nicomachean Ethics to me is the missing footnote in the politics to explain us what the lexicon akuron means. In other words, the Homeric king would be the curious that is missing if we follow that train of thought. And this has consequences in our understanding of Aristotle, I think, but also in our understanding of what's wrong with women. And also in our understanding on why what's wrong with women has been so persistent as a way of thinking. And what is the point for me? The point is that what's wrong with women, if we follow Aristotle's train of thought, is not a lack of rationality or intelligence, as often we read even in, very knowledgeable and authoritative interpreters of Aristotle. It's not a matter of rationality, it's not a matter of intelligence, it's not a matter of cognition. It is a matter precisely of that intentional intensity of which the Homeric king is capable, together with all the men who have a Homeric king in their own soul, and that intentionality of which women are not capable. That's exactly the missing piece of equipment. What's missing is the capacity to bring to an end a decision intentionally. And that intentionality, I think, can be plausibly connected to tumults, to the spiritedness that is characteristic of the male for Aristotle, which is made possible by the endowment of natural heat that characterizes male living beings beyond the human. Aristotle is, in his own way, one of the great posthumans, or pre-posthumans, if you want. Males are better endowed in natural heat. This makes them all as living beings tumotera. All animals are more better endowed with tumors, and tumors has all sorts of effects in your character. It really shapes your character as a male. And it makes you more inclined to fight, more competitive, more inclined to rule. So there is really a possibility, a potential, which is in you as a faculty, as a desire. Tumos is a pathos, is a form of orexis at the same time. Hence my use of the word intentionality that captures precisely the wishing, wanting, the drive, the momentum of this way of being in the world. And tumos is there precisely to keep you going, or to give you the energy. And all women are poorly endowed with natural heat. Women and females in general are colder than men, anatomically, physiologically, and therefore are less endowed with tumors, and therefore are less courageous, and therefore have an inferior lot of everything that is a consequence of tumors. And therefore, tumors takes us to the Homeric king, because that intentional moment in the proairesis that really brings a decision-making process to an end, if it is personified visually and vividly by the Homeric kings, it brings into the picture, the semantic picture, precisely thumos, because when Aristotle tells us how they function, these Homeric kings, well, they are full of thumos, and precisely they are the paradigm. These Homeric warriors and kings and leaders, they are the paradigm of courage and of courage as thumos. So see, I think there is really a way of thinking that is a bit like a sea snake, as the French would say, that goes up and down in the surface of the text. But I think there is a very, very strong consistency and coherence there. So that in a sense, in a good proairesis, to come to the end, you need that Homeric king, you need that masculinity, you need that spiritedness, you need that thumos, you need in a sense that courage, because thumos is also synergically involved in Andrea. Courage is manliness in antiquity. So already in, just to translate like this, we have said a lot. So just to bring to an end any decision in your daily life, for any single decision, you need that Homeric king, you need that oomph, you need that thumos, you need that internal masculinity, and you need that courage, because thumos synergically enters into Andrea. So if you are a woman, you are out of that moment. You meander in the decision-making process, okay? But then you stop. And I think that this is what Aristotle tries to tell you, although in this displaced manner between the politics, the biological works, and the Nicomachean ethics about women. And that's the crippling part. Because if women cannot deliberate properly until the end, well, what are the consequences? No politics at all. Can a woman with a bouleutikon acheron be a member of the boule? Can she go to the ecclesia? Can she participate in a debate and finally say something that is the expression of a resolute determination? Or will she continue to weigh? In a sense, one of the manners in which I try to describe this ironically, I say, when inadvertently Aristotle tells us that women have invented skepticism. So women go and weigh and perhaps, and let me think of some more about it. And how we say today, women are multitasking. That is what it means. They are contextual, we are contextual. In other words, we cannot get to the point. We cannot cut to the chase. This is what Aristotle tells us. So politics is out. Democratic politics is out institutionally, but any form of leadership is out. Even in the house, you cannot be a leader, because, it would be easy if we were thinking, oh, Aristotle, thinks structurally binary opposition inside outside, the men do all these wonderful deliberations and actions outside, whereas women at least have a leadership inside, in the house, in the oikos. But it's not true there. That's precisely the point, because in Politics 1, Aristotle tells us that one, women have a bouleutikon acheron, and which is obviously connected, women and men in the conjugal relationship engage in a rapport that it is analogous to a political rapport, not a monarchical one, not a despotic one, but a political rapport. But this political rapport is defined by rotation of archeing and archestype, which is a way of establishing a form of equality, of toism, not exactly literal in in the text, but that's the idea of cohesion, of what is equal. However, there is a but, and the but is that between women and men, the alternation never happens. So that for me, the first time I read this text, I said, this is what I'm going to work on. And it was precisely Madre Materia, that first sort of brief dissertation that I wrote in Italy many, many years ago. That was the text that really got me going. I said, it's not possible that in Aristotle, in 3 lines, you have this relationship can be described on the basis of the analogy with rotation, but the rotation never happened. So,
what gives Aristotle?
I mean, yeah. I'm speechless. I'm speechless. This is the sort of twists and turns that I think are interesting to track down in Aristotle. So that there is an always at the core of the oikia, that is the always, among others, other always, of the superior time of the male upon the woman. And therefore, deliberative faculty without authority means no politics, but deliberative faculty without authority, as I was saying, means also zero authority in the house. And if we think that this is just 3 lines in Politics 1, let's think that in the history of natural law until today in the US, when we read natural law scholars and jurists who engage in discussions on the family, on abortion, on gay marriage, etc. So natural law means the Western legal thought and moral philosophy together. Well, this has meant to justify the potestas of the father in the house, legally, morally, politically, socially, as a matter of opinion. So Aristotle really sets the stage for a real paradigm. This is not just a sort of metaphor. There is a paradigm of the difference between men and women, and Aristotle really builds that paradigm with a couple of sentences, and this enters into the tradition of Christianity with Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus first, and Thomas Aquinas, and many other Aristotelian scholars and commentators and translators, and it goes on and on and on, somehow carried by the tradition of natural law. Because in the tradition of natural law, we have these truths that are engraved in our own soul, and rationally we understand these truths. We find them basically reasonable and self-evident, and these truths are present. It's not just innate ideas. These are rules. This is why it's called natural law. So these are normative indications about what we must do, we should do, that are there in us naturally and at the same time prescriptive. Now, these are not any kind of ideas. These ideas, let's read Thomas Aquinas, which I have put in
the handout.
In the handout, and definition of natural law and description of the content of what is meant by natural law. Natural law is about being and time, actually. It's about understanding the goodness of being and the conservation of this goodness of being in time. This is the starting point. And second step, the being in time of living beings is procreation, is generation. Individuals are mortal, species are immortal. So generation procreation is to keep being over time, is the preservation of being, that in the Christian theological perspective becomes the protection of creation. How do you do that in practice? Through heterosexual cohesion and procreation. So this is why natural law has at its own core precisely the imperative to generate children. It's an ontological imperative. This imperative to procreate children, to educate them, and therefore heterosexuality is fundamental. And the family is fundamental. And within the family, the appropriateness of the task of women and men is also essential. So you can see that in this really cornerstone that keeps together the world, because if you are a natural law thinker, you really look at this as the building block on which the entire universe stands. You can see that, of course, you cannot really discuss about rights here. You discuss about natural law, and you have all your Aristotle is there. You have politics one, practically, and you have already engraved there as a necessity the asymmetry between women and men, because in all the comments you will find, you will be told that precisely in order for the family to be the place where procreation and education of children is made possible, in order to get the family like this, you need that particular structure of the couple, which is asymmetrical. Women do what's good for women, men do what's good for men. And then when we go into Aristotle and then Thomas Aquinas and others, we discover that men have access to all the virtues in their better version, and in a version that is made for men to be able to rule, and women are stuck to virtues that are inferior. But it's not just a matter of more or less, even though if a man had the courage of a woman, he would be considered a coward. So you have a question of more or less. The courage of a woman is the cowardice of a man. So there is a gap there. And on top of the gap, you have the function, you have the ergo. So men's virtues are made to make possible for men to command, to direct, to rule, to administer, to deliberate and decide for themselves and for others. The Homeric king is always there. And for women, virtues are service virtues. So virtus ministrativa, this is huge. It's huge. You know, it justifies all the legal constructions of families in the laws of European countries. I have been looking at the history of the reforms of family law in the 70s, especially in France or in Italy. And you can see that precisely before that time, it is inscribed in the law, this idea that there is no equality in the family between mothers and fathers, that women are always in the position which is subordinate, which is precisely serviceable, which is ancillary. And, let's go back at the justification of the Catholic Church as we speak for not admitting women to priesthood. As Paul VI was saying in Italian, was saying, in an opera, you have the tenor and you have the soprano, and so in society you have men and you have women and you have fathers and you have mothers, and they have different voices and etc. someone will at some point turn the tables, and there are various attempts to disconnect the potentiality for power and the sense of possibility from these ideas of endowment, of equipment, of connection with the body, of the specificity of the character according to female versus male. There are several people who try to turn the table, Christine de Pizan, even in a sense, Plato had tried to turn the table in his own way. Tragedy turns the table in its own way, and it goes on. It's very interesting to reconstruct precisely the dissenting voice vis-a-vis this very powerful paradigm. And then we have people such as François Poulain de la Barre, which is a maverick. It's a very weird figure because this is, people say, oh, it's a Cartesian, so we think that the body doesn't matter and reason matter. No, it's a very simple, I think, a simple way of explaining away the strangeness, the bizarreness of this man who is a Catholic priest and then converted to Calvinism, and who really, you know, throws away all the association of ideas between virility, masculinity, strength, intelligence, self-control on the one hand, and femininity, indecisiveness, fluctuation, and incapacity as far as politics and knowledge are concerned. So these people exist, but we have to wait really for the end of the 18th century to have someone like Condorcet who really gives us an entire project of rethinking of genders. I would like to add just a comment on the transition from Aristotle's texts in the plural to the Christian interpretations, comments, and translations. And it gets even worse with Christianity. It really gets worse because whereas, in a sense, it's part of the argument that I'm trying to make in the book, whereas for Aristotle, women are not less intelligent than men, they are even more intelligent than men. In the logic of Aristotle, if you have less tumors, you have more dianoia, and you are better at technique. More tumors, you are unmanageable. You are so boiling that you cannot really function. So masculinity is a liability, actually. And we discover this correlation in Book 7 of the Politics, where Aristotle tells us that the world is divided into kind of people who live in different climates that have an influence on the internal heat. So you have the people from the north who are so ebullient because it's cold outside. Therefore, their skin becomes thicker and the heat stays inside. And so they are constantly boiling. This blood is constantly boiling. And they want to wage war to everything. The Celts wage wars to the sea. To the sea. So
I believe those are the Ukrainians who call themselves.
They wage war to the sea, so they are incapable of politics because, you know, they want to be free. They cannot enter in the rotation of ruling and being ruled, of course. So now we think, in the Nicomachean ethics, virtue is in between excesses. So, you know, too much Andrea is not good. Okay, and so too much tumors not good, either is not good. And then you have Asian people who live in a very soft climate, very lukewarm climate. Therefore, their internal heat flees out of the body through the porosity of the body. It's very materialistic. You know, this is new materialism is made for us. Read this text. The heat flows out of the body. Therefore, they are lukewarm inside. And therefore, they have less tumors. They are submissive. They don't try to fight continuously. Unfortunately, this is connected to the theory of natural slavery. They make better slaves. They are more intelligent, more dianoia, more technical. So if you extend to gender this kind of correlations, which I think we are absolutely authorized to do while thinking with Aristotle, then women too. And if we read History of Animals, the difference between female animals, female, let's say, living being, non-human animals, on the one hand, and males, aligns perfectly, because females are smarter, they learn better, they think better about their children. So the cognitive ability, care, astuteness, cunning, intelligence is on the side of women. So women are better there. But what's missing is the resoluteness. What Heidegger, very good reader of Aristotle, will, think as a form of resoluteness. That's the missing thing. So for Aristotle, to go back to the Christian transition, for Aristotle, the problem is practical reason. The problem is proairism, is the liberation. Then Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas come and they say, no, reason is weak. And from them, you have this sort of more and more damning conception of women's incapacity, not only to make decisions, but also just to think, just to stay, one step after the other in the logic of what you're saying. Why? Because since women's complexity, women's temperament is so fluid, because they are cold, periods, menstruations, all this floating of the female body. And therefore the soul is in a sense also unstable and fluid. And therefore women think something and then they forget, because a wave of humidity comes and takes that idea away, and then there is a passion that comes along, and then there is fear or concupiscence, etc. So you have a very, banalized, actually, dualistic idea of male rationality versus female irrationality. I think that this is really an effect of the Christian reading of Aristotle, whereas Aristotle is more interesting and complicated. And let us be a little bit. Perhaps I should stop, because the conversation has been a terrible monologue.
This was entirely the point of having you here. So the questions ramify in every direction. When you were talking about the Homeric king, I was reminded that Richard Bentley, the great text critic and philologist of the early 18th century, said that the Iliad was written for men and the Odyssey for women. And this is because the Iliad is full of thumos, and Odysseus is the hero of Dianoia and Glossa and Techne, right? And Metis. Metis is Metis is the key here, isn't it? Yeah. Can we go back to the Athenian city? It strikes me that in order for the deliberative faculty to become kouron and not akuron, one has to be able to enter the agon.
Absolutely.
So that women, for instance, cannot enter the legal agon in Athens. No. They must be represented by the Kyrios, right? Exactly. Who is kouron.
Do you want to translate those terms for the uninitiated?
The Kyrios is just the household sovereign, in effect, right? Because kouros and Kyrios mean sovereign, as in Kyria, ecclesia in the city, and so on, right? The sovereign assembly.
The person who has authority, who is responsible to. I think. What do you say?
And also have citizenship.
Yeah, I mean, it's really it's a word that is it's very, very, very pervasive in Aristotle. But yes, you know, it's the same family of words. You're absolutely right. It is as if the woman didn't have a curious inside. A woman doesn't have a responsible part of herself that belongs to herself. The curious is her father, brother, husband, and even a son who is major, who is more than 18 years old, can represent a woman, as you say. So, but sorry, I've interrupted.
No, not at all. No, so I was just thinking then, what is it that allows a deliberative faculty in a man to become sovereign, to become put on? Is it implied violence? Because if we go back to the Homeric poems, if we go back before the democratic city, and we go back and we think, what is the Homeric hero praised for? He's praised for his action in war, and his action in the Bulessus, right? He's a good in council and good on the battlefield. And those two things are entangled, right? You've got to be not just good at one or the other, but you've got to be good at both. And so it's one thing to be able to deliberate, it's another thing to be able to project the violence and the intimidation necessary to be able to carry that through. And that seems to be always what is implied in early Greek thought, that the man can carry through his deliberation with the threat of force.
Absolutely. And I think that the image of the Homeric king, of the sort of that principle of leadership inside, or a humanon, which does the proairesis as a Homeric king, captures exactly this synthesis that I've tried in a sense to unpack, because one could say, oh, deliberation is a cognitive process, it's a moral process. Whereas no, there is precisely this component of leadership, let's say violence. We can call it violence, virility, in a sense, playing with this kind of resonances, because let's perhaps two lines of argumentation here could go parallel until they come together. One is the sort of cultural association between war and politics, to put it in a very large manner. It's true in Homer, where pace, dumesil, and the distinction of the sovereign function and the warrior functions, we were talking about it. Actually, kings are warriors, and warriors, when they are in position of leadership, are kings. So precisely the hero describes all, fuming with all that blood that is boiling. So the heat is there in Homer. The association between the physicality of heat and tumos is already there. Is the same person. The same person is a commander and a warrior. Then there are the warriors who are not commanders, but perhaps in their own home, they are still commanders. But in the Homeric scenario, you have this synthesis of belligerence, courage, capacity to struggle, the rage of winning, wanting to win, on the one hand, and the ability and the drive to command, because commanding in this discourse is not something that you enjoy. It's a chore, it's a challenge, it's a burden, and you have to be up to it. So there is a sort of drama of power and violence here, as something that, Hegelian shadow here, you risk your life at any second. So masculinity is about taking up the challenge of risking your life any second. And how do you risk your life? You fight, you want to win, you don't want to lose, and therefore you want to command. Because victory and command go together. Now, if we go to ancient democracy, well, first of all, you are a citizen, you are a warrior. This is the social assemblage, the social montage of what it means to become a citizen, thank you, and a man in antiquity. So if there is a training and a coaching and a sort of a rite de passage, it has all to do with war. And then the reality of your existence as an Athenian male is that as an Anel endowed with Andrea, you are constantly exposed to that sort of ambition. Do you have that aspiration? Do you have that thumos or that prothumia that pushes you to risk your life in war and pushes you in the ecclesia to walk to the podium and in the pnyx and, you know, talk to that crowd or talk against an interlocutor? So I think that the antagonism of democracy fits particularly well the ethos of war. And this is why the famous narrative that democracy, let's say polity, as Aristotle would say, with its transformation democracy, is, as the self-government of the many, is something that has been invented by the hoplites or goes with the hoplites. It goes with men who don't want to be always governed and ruled by others. So there is this idea that to be a democratic man, you need to be a warrior, because you need that character. You need that intolerance to be constantly ruled. And so you compromise in rotation with ruling with ruled. And this is the condition for all of us to get a chance to find ourselves in that position. So you see how Aristotle is really the one who understands Athenian democracy beyond the blame, beyond the mixed feelings, etc. I think he's the one who has really got the sense of how it works.
In a sense, Aristotle is, if he is the anthropologist,
I think
then
the
the society that the field work that he's doing is in Athens, isn't it? So that Athens then becomes the kind of the polis par excellence for Aristotle in the background.
He is a comparatist, so he wants us to see comparisons and contrasts and difference and a taxonomy of forms of government. But yes, I think that Aristotle has a real care to know and will to knowledge directed to the culture in which he was living.
But I would agree, absolutely. But another form of government, of course, is tyrannis, which is problematic to the polis. But if we go outside the democracy, suddenly we find women who do command and who are interested in fighting and are very good warriors. And we find them in Ionia, in Halicarnassus. We have this amazing woman in Herodotus, Artemisia, who embodies all of those things that you just described. She is full of thumos. She is
capable of Andrea because
she has courage. Yeah, in fact, she has exemplary courage. Xerxes is amazed by her courage. My women have become men, she says. Right? He says. Now to sort of put that in the picture, because you have a whole chapter on Artemisia. She also has metis as well, doesn't she? Because
she has gnome.
Yeah.
She is a very cunning, and she has lema, so she is resolute.
That's right. She has ambition, doesn't she?
She has ambition, and she has that decisiveness. So and she has a vision. Artemisia is, in a sense, the reversal, we could say, and the proof that it's possible, that power, potential, possibility is actually there, because precisely in antiquity, democracy is the worst possible form of government for women, because democracy is such a natural thing. It's, I want to govern myself. I cannot do it all the time, so I consent to take turns. But that's the point. I don't want to be governed all the time. And therefore, the other line that I think when we read Aristotle, we want to keep in mind, but this goes far beyond Aristotle, back to Thumos, because Thumos is all about that energy, that spiritedness in Homer, in Plato, in Aristotle, that makes you jump, gives you really that momentum. And this is also in the handout, you know, these moments in which Aristotle qualifies Thumos, and he says that is indomitable. It is toarchikon, it is the principle of ruling. So, you know, to want to rule, you need to have that drive. It's a drive. It's a drive, it's an orexis. Let's remember, it's a pathos, it's an orexis, it's an intentional drive. And it is archikon and aepteton. So
Handout 5.
yes, sorry, and handout number 5. And and by nature, the male is more inclined to command than the female. So hegemony coteron, but you can see that it's not that in every single sentence Aristotle repeats because of Thumos, but if you put together these moments, you have a line of thought that says a male is more hegemonic. Why? Well, because we learned that all male animals are more endowed of Thumos, they are more courageous, they are more therefore wanting to command and want to win. Because I want to go back to what you were saying, which is so important, that antagonism and desire to command go together in this Aristotelian anthropology or social psychology or ethics discourse on character. It's not that either you are belligerent and antagonistic and you like to fight in the assembly, so you are a nice democratic, liberally democratic citizen, or you are someone who wants to be a general. You need both go together, because even to discuss, you need to want to win the argument. So all, you know, what Dimitris, I think, would agree about, the intrinsic agonistic nature of ancient democracy. You don't try to have a conversation, you try to win. You try to win. And therefore, if you try to win, you want to be victorious, you want to prevail, you want to rule, you want to command, you want to crash your adversary. See, I think that really we have a very interesting conception of power here that can be thought through all these questions. But I've seen Dimitris very patiently waiting. I don't know if
Demetrius has a question. Do you want to? Should we throw to the?
I can see also Emma has already opened the book and has a reference ready to go. Look, I was wondering whether you can sort of consider that there is a possibility of a dialectical reversal, so to speak, because you know, Aristotle is not a Democrat, nor is Plato. You know, nothing democratic.
Did I say that?
No. Of course not. Of course, but like. The point I want to make is, like, if you look at the sort of metaphorics of how democracy is presented in Plato and Aristotle, the typical critique is the fact that democracy cannot lead to decisions. You know, the figure of the ungovernable vote in the Republic that is repeated a few times, significantly immediately after the discussion of the philosopher king, or the description of democracy in comparison with the other constitutions in politics. What is democracy is that multi-colored fabric that doesn't really know what it wants.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Later, yeah.
Well, the fabric definitely exists definitely is in Aristotle, maybe it's in Plato too. But I mean, the common denominator there is the lack of proeresis, the lack of vouleptikon. You know, democracy has no vouleptikon. So I was wondering whether, you know, there's a possibility of dialectical reversal to say, well, you know, the problem with democracy is also that it's too womanly, too weak. Whereas we aristocrats, referring to the Homeric kings who have nothing to do with the democratic leaders, we aristocrats, we being Aristotle, Plato, the Lyceum and the Academy, we need to be manly as opposed to the womanly democracy. I was wondering whether you will entertain a dialectical reversal like that.
I would say that what you say resonates for me with Republic 8, where the embroidered and multi-hued cloth that is the model of democracy is perhaps a beautiful city. Is this the real Callipolis? Is this a beautiful city? Yes, certainly, but for women and children. So you could say, I mean, if we go with Plato, I can see that metaphorical line or that alignment, so to speak, semantic alignment in a very nice, interesting way. There is confusion, this is casualness, precisely there is constant fluctuation in democracy. No, there isn't the capacity to decide and to think that is in the mind of the philosopher king. I'm entirely with you on that. With Aristotle, I would say that it depends if you look at the group of people who meet in the ecclesia as one body, as a sort of agent of decision. You could look at the decision-making process as this meandering and weighing and wasting time in all sorts of options and possibilities and the inability of deciding. But the decree, Aristotle says, is a piece of proairesis. So at the end, there is a decision. And I think that, you know, if we apply Aristotle's anthropological vision to the practice of democracy, and we imagine these people, even say that there is a meeting and people are fighting with each other, are profoundly disagreeing with each other. But in the moment they have to express their opinion will be strong and decisive, will be, this is what I think, this is what we should do. Then perhaps, you know, let's think of Cleon in Thucydides, the famous Deodatus and Cleon debate. Cleon, every sentence is a decision. He knows what is good, what is better, what should be done. And he's, you know, somehow shaking all these people who don't come to a decision or who are wasting their time precisely. Deodatus, in his own way, is constantly producing decisions. So it seems to me that what Aristotle is saying about women is the following. If woman is what Aristotle says that woman is or can be, you can't imagine that kind of human being or agent or subject in an ecclesia, in a boule, in a committee about the restoration of the walls, or at the head of an army. So if we, in a sense, play what if Aristotle's woman were to walk into the ecclesia?
Well,
Aristophanes, let's imagine a sort of Aristophanic experiment.
I can agree with that. I can also point out to Aristotle saying, well, there is no, you know, there is movement between the constitutions. There is no pure democracy, you know. So that moment in
there is metabole.
Exactly, you know, that's very clear in politics. I can also say to you, well, you know, that moment in the ecclesia that you're describing, the decision-making moment, that's the aristocratic kind of taking over the democratic in Aristotle. You know, that's you know, the man kind of pushing aside the democratic indecision. You know. Anyway, that's how I read it.
No, but if I understand what you're saying, if we take the demos, as this collective being, like divided in itself, sort of precisely going in a direction and the other direction, to see this as depiction of the Athenians make a decision and then the day after they think about it and then make another decision. A very feminine scene, we could
Exactly,
say.
the lack of lexicon.
So take Aristotle's characterization of the leutikon akoron and put it there, and take Demos, one of my favorite depiction of Demos in Aristophanes' Knights. You know, he has all the flaws, he's credulous, whoever is speaking, you know, and offering more, he goes with that. Exactly. So if we want a parody of, or a more or less sophisticated criticism of democracy, we talk about the demos as a collective, as a woman. Mm-hmm. I'm with you. Then if we like democracy, we will talk about the demos as a collective extension of a heroic character. I'm with you that like that. So in a sense, what I was saying is that the democratic man, if we follow Aristotle's train of thought, the democratic man, when we praise him, when we appreciate the Andrea, the resoluteness, the participation, the virility, we read against Marcus, we read all this characterization of how non-effeminate a man might be or must be. If we look at the democratic citizen as good, as an aner, then of course he is noble. He is kalos kaiagathos. The model is aristocratic, absolutely. The model is aristocratic for the people as a collective. When we want to praise the people as a collective, aristocracy is a model for the individual as a heroic, decisive warrior and citizen at the same time. And to have the Homeric man, the Homeric king in yourself, is precisely the characteristic of the good democratic man. The good democratic man who knows how to make a decision, who's resolute and capable of liberty, has a king inside. So yes, I thank you, because you know, even more you make me turn around this. And salvation for women is monarchy, is aristocracy, because depiction of women in aristocratic and monarchic context allows for the acknowledgement of all the virtues that Aristotle says that women don't have.
Well, that may be a point where we could turn to another democratic scenario, which is in the theatre of Dionysus.
Yes.
In tragedy.
Yes.
Because to resume a conversation we had earlier, right, where the vexed question, were women allowed to attend the theatre in Athens? Do we come down on the side of no, they weren't, precisely because one needs to be in the audience of drama, one needs to have the capacity to deliberate on what one is witnessing, right, on the stage. But then, as you rightly point out too, there is an internal deliberative audience in tragedy. And then also in chapter 4 of your book, you draw our attention to perhaps the aristocratic voices that are latent within Athens, that are allowed to speak, but only through the tragic stage, right? These are the old Homeric and mythological kings and queens of the old world, who are banished from the democracy in the here and now, but they come back to us, they come alive again on the tragic stage, and they speak wisdom to us, right? And they speak like Jocasta and Aethra and so on. And these are women who are giving advice to the city So is tragedy is the tragic stage and perhaps also the comic stage a place where the Athenians can accept advice from women?
I think the short answer is yes. And this is a paradoxical dynamic, I think, that becomes very interesting if we accept precisely the paradox, the tension, the improbability, as opposed to trying to downplay it. In other words, well, we could say there is a democratic culture in Athens. There are values, there are ideas, there is an ethos, there is a conformity. It's all about equality, it's all about self-control, it's all about connectivity, it's all about the people, the people, the people. But then the Athenians watch The Crown and like it.
Yes.
So,
It's lovely. Yeah.
it is something, you know, how many conversations I had, very pleasant, because I watched in the US, where people, you know, are so fascinated by the old world, the English world, the aristocracy, and so on and so forth. So you could say, what is this jouissance of, in a democratic culture that prides itself on all the values of the collective, of the egalitarian, of the non-prevailing form of individuality? Why the fascination for these forms of sociability, for these manners, for these aesthetics also? Is it just a fantasy? It's a fantasy. It's a precisely because it's so distant, it's fascinating. Okay, this is a sort of default explanation that I keep on the side, the Crown explanation. But I think perhaps we should be humbler and try to just look at the paradox in Athens and say, okay, look at the content of these tragedies that are all about kings and queens and princes and princesses, and then they speak, because as Aristotle says, tragedy is full of dianoia, it's full of logoi, it's full of praxis and of words that prepare that praxis, and it's full of proairesis, it's full of decisions, because what happens on stage, decisions, tidrazo, what should I do, etc. So, about what? About what? Well, about the limits of power, what is good, what is bad, what is just, what is unjust, how power should be distributed, how positions of arcane should be exchanged with position of non-arcane, and this motion, this rotation is important. So in other words, tragedy is full of political theory. Tragedy is full of moral philosophy. I really take seriously the dianoia component of tragedy. You know, now there is a very strong and very wonderful trend in reading tragedy, especially in terms of spectacle. Right? Let's recuperate the theatrical dimension of theater. Let's not flatten a play on a text. I'm entirely in agreement. However, let's not, in a sense, minimize dianoia, and that dianoia, that content, is in large part a sort of way of playing around, so to speak, with the values of democracy, toism, the duration of power, the anti-tyrannical leitmotif, the necessary alternation of archaic and archetype. It's a crucial theme in Antigone, for instance. So tragedy is a place where democracy is paradoxically, and I emphasize paradoxically, theorized. And women seem to be in the position of precisely theorizing democracy. So my idea is somehow still in progress, under construction here, is that paradoxically again, women are those who offer mirrors to princes, to male princes, but they are the women from the past. So these women from the past, paradoxically queens and princesses, aristocratic thinkers, they teach men how to handle power and tumults properly. This is what they do. So Elizabeth Belfiore, has this interpretation of tragedy when she says one of the most important passions in tragedy is tumults, and tragedy has a lot to do with the taming of tumults, the taming of, Bernard Knox, the heroic temper. I think that was a great book. I don't know, it's a book that perhaps we don't read enough any longer in our seminars and courses. But there is something there. And women do that job. It's women who tame the tumults. Mothers, but not only mothers. So paradoxically, it is as if women in tragedy were represented as upholding and promoting the values of democracy. So quicksand, it's completely surprising. And I think that perhaps we should read tragedy in this completely amazed manner, because it takes an aristocrat to theorize democracy. It takes a woman to theorize democracy. And this flies absolutely.
Yeah, it takes a tyrant. It takes Artemisia to show the Athenians what courage is, right?
What courage is. And so the Athenian men, if they are only men sitting in the audience, I tend to incline toward this response to the question, and I'm aware that it's a question. Enjoy this. So what kind of pleasure is that? And I think that it's a sort of paradoxical pleasure, this theatrical pleasure. These women, Aethra and Antigone, has nothing to do with their wife. Their wife is back home, incapable of making decisions, keeping up with the domestic chores and preserving the accumulation of wealth. That is the responsibility of the men. And it's a sort of aesthetic, cognitive dissonance, perhaps, this experience, but certainly the same men who have that kind of women, who are, legally minors, who are completely excluded from politics, and who are not participating in war, who are, considered to be as inferior, morally inferior, and physically inferior human beings. So the same man thinks like Aristotle. I know that there are many different voices, but they mostly align with what Aristotle has to say about women. So the same man has Aristotle in his brain, has an Aristotelian brain as far as his wife is concerned, but he goes to the theater and he applauds Aethra or Jocasta or Antigone. Perhaps we have to accept just that as a form of cognitive aesthetic dissonance. And Aristotle in the Poetics, when he talks about character, about ethos, he says, ethos has to do with decision-making processes, with priors. If the decisions are good, the character is good. So a character is an agent of priorities. So this is why I like to call the poetics a theatrical ethics, so to speak, because you have really a mini ethics in the poetics when you go and look at the treatment of ethos. And he has this incredible center, which is characters have to be plausible and appropriate. And so poets should not represent women who are formidable and courageous. So, you know,
Yeah,
the theater must go.
the theatre must go.
The theater must
Yeah,
go,
that's right. Yeah,
because
well, Plato takes care of that, doesn't he?
Yeah, we have.
Plato takes care better.
Yeah.
of it.
We have some questions.
Oh, sorry.
We have some questions from Zoom.
Go to Catherine Welsh first.
Go to Catherine. Yeah, Catherine. Thank you patiently waiting there, Catherine.
It's okay. It's all really fascinating and I'm learning a lot. Can I fast forward you, Giulia, please, down to the Enlightenment? I really would like to hear you take what you've told us about all these ancient contexts, and you've presented us, it seems to me, with 2 points of view from your Enlightenment representatives. There's Rousseau on the one side, and then there's your more friendly people on the other. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little to how you see those two working together. And I have to declare my hand. I have an agenda in all of this. I've been working on similar material, but with very different outcomes in the Roman context. And particularly looking at how those imbued with, say, the Rousseau side of things dominate the way, the frameworks of our narrative in Roman history. A very interesting role in how we see it. So I'd love you, if you could, to go down to that part of your work about which I know that you will know a damn sight more than I do. I'd love to hear you.
Thank you very much. How should I?
Well, the microphone's there, so.
And the camera's there, so you're.
And we can hear you perfectly. We've been able to hear everything.
Thank you very, very much for this question. Well, I have a profound antipathy for Rousseau.
Yeah, well, understandably, I've developed one.
I'm happy we can converge on that mood, let's say, on that mood of reading, because there is a mood in Rousseau's way of writing, because Rousseau seems to me really embrace natural law. To put it shortly, I have tried to follow really the vocabulary of nature and law, and the laws of nature, and what is inscribed in us in this both innate and normative manners. And Rousseau keeps repeating and repeating and repeating that women are different kind of human beings. First of all, a woman is always a woman, which is the most horrible that you can say about any human being. In other words, to pin down that person to one quality. And there is everything in that sentence, that you are entirely in your range of possibilities. You are entirely into your being femme, a woman. And what is a woman? A woman is someone who cannot reason, cannot have a conversation, is only interested in what's superficial, what's frivolous, what stays. She's cute and nice with children, and she gets along with children because she's fundamentally a child herself. And she creates this world of comfort and coziness where the man will come back in the evening. I mean, all the worst possible sexist banalities are there, written in this absolutely wonderful, sublime, elegant French that obviously is even more infuriating. At least if it was the right, it's horrible. No, it's marvelous. So, and there is everything, and women are stuck. Rousseau engages in conversations about the possibility for women to obtain rights. And what does he say? Another sentence that's even worse than the previous one, which is that women want right that they would usurp. So if a woman wants a right to education, for instance, the rights Condorcet will talk about, that would be usurpation. So there is really a non-entitlement to any form of right. Women have to do what by nature, and following the laws of nature, they are supposed to do, they can do, and they, absolutely must continue to do. So there is a real rejection of any possibility of transformation and of any disconnection of a notion of right from a notion of les lois de la nature, natural law. And I see, on the contrary, to reply to your question, I see really a really turning point when Condorcet, and I take Condorcet because he is so vocal, so precise, so relentless in his argumentations about these things, really goes to that particular point and say a right has nothing to do with the merit. So it's a huge thing to do. And that is precisely, to go against all the natural law way of thinking that you can do, you are allowed to do. Let me repeat, you are allowed to do what you can do, which is what you are unable to do by your own nature. And there is this sort of continuity between the body, the character, the ability, the possibility, and therefore the social recognition, the legal recognition, the political recognition. Condorcet throws all this away and say, enough with this chain of thought. Rights are completely separate from merit. So enough with this meritocracy that attributes to men this capacity to rule a house that we all know that, by the way, is absolutely foolish and non-existent, but even. So, what it takes as a form of intellectual and moral and political audacity, what it takes to say, let's stop thinking in these quote unquote meritocratic terms. Let's start to think that as human beings, each of us, across ethnicities, across races, across genders, Condorcet is an intersectional thinker, in a big, big way. Each human individual is equipped, is endowed with a minimal level of reasonableness. We are sensible beings, capable of entertaining even very few moral ideas and of reason about these moral ideas. This is enough, and we all have it. Then with education, we can improve, we can better, we can make more complicated. Then there are people who are geniuses and there are people who are not geniuses. But rights go with that minimal common denominator of reasonableness that we have as human beings, period. So don't tell me that there are people who are wonderful as kings, as mathematicians, and all this is fine. But in order to have access to citizenship, it's not necessary to be a genius. Condorcet is very witty, and he says it. Since when we ask men to be geniuses in order to do politics? So why? Of course, everyone finds that it's absurd and preposterous and ludicrous. So why do we exclude an entire group, half of humanity, women, from the space of politics, with the pretext, with the excuse that these women would be, all of them, statistically, he's a mathematician, as you know, so the great theorist of statistical thinking. All women, or statistically, all women would be under the bar. It's not possible. Statistically, it's not possible. So, in the same way as you accept ordinary people who are not so smart, or even who have physically having dispositions that could be comparable to periods, you let them participate in the life of the city. In the same way, you should let the women do it, because statistically, we don't know if women are all of them inferior to men. And we don't know it. Why? Because we haven't been educating women. So we are comparing a part of humanity which is non-educated with a part of humanity which is educated. Let's educate women to start. Let's recognize the right of women to be educated and to learn how better to exercise their minimal rights. And then we'll see. But in the meantime, we all share this. Once again, I insist on the minimality, because I think that in Condorcet's mathematical way of thinking, this becomes an extraordinary weapon of moral normativity. Minimal. Let's stop talking about, oh, look at Augustus, where is, well, we could find, of course, Condorcet is one who says, look at Elizabeth, look at the great queens, etc. But queens shows the possibility, are the exception that shows the possibility of the exception. And this is part of the picture, of the argumentative picture. But the most important thing is to say, human beings, we have this basic capacity of reason. And this is what is enough. And rights do not require a merit. That is enough.
Can I? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just wondering whether I might push this a little further, though. I mean, I take the point about the 2 points of view. That's really interesting. But when you look at the history of women in France from the time of Rousseau, wouldn't you have to say that Rousseau won?
Oh, yes.
Because his point of view is totally enshrined in the Napoleonic Code, and women are absolutely rubbished in French law for a century.
Absolutely.
And also that point of view, I think, fed more, let us say, Enlightenment philosophers than your contrary opinion did. So it makes it even more culpable for a Rousseau or a Stendhal or a Theodore Mommsen, who's my guy, to have this point of view, when in fact they've got an alternative out there to look to. They've got alternative debates out there to look to. It's no good to say, oh, that's how they thought at the time, because you're absolutely showing us that they didn't have to. And yet they can enshrine a totally iniquitous legal code in 1804 that lasts all the way down to 1944 and beyond.
Absolutely. And the ideas were circulating. You know, Condorcet, as we know, ended very badly, but you know, the ideas were there, were argued, were circulating. There was a huge debate even among the writers in the encyclopedia. It's very interesting to look at the various articles of the encyclopedia on women, on natural law, on rights, etc. So people debate, people discuss. There are all sorts of different texts and all sorts of different voices. And I couldn't agree more with you. Rousseau has won because Rousseau had on his side precisely the tradition of natural law, which was the authoritative one. Because, you know, I would say 90% or perhaps 100% of the professors of natural right or natural law in the universities from Geneva to Paris to Oxford were teaching natural law as the conception of the law. So Rousseau was part of the paradigm still resisting, still holding on. And then in the 19th century, you have even the backlash, cultural backlash against the revolution accentuates even more let's say the conservatism of this way of thinking. So I couldn't agree more. But there are these singular voices, and the very strange character we were alluding to at the beginning, Francois Poulain de la Barre, he has written a lot about women. They are debunking one after the other all the prejudices of women's frivolity, stupidity, fluctuations, etc., and weakness and softness, etc. And he writes several works. He was translated into English, and his ideas were not just recondite, not at all. So there was a huge debate, but the paradigm was very solid. And so even Condorcet didn't have the impact that we would like for him to have had. But I think that it's very important to read these people now, also to show once again the possibility. It's even
yeah.
We have two more questions and we're fast running out of time. So no, you're right. We'll throw to Emma Bianchi and then we might take two questions at once, do you think?
Yeah.
So we'll go, Emma, we'll hear your question and then we'll quickly hear Anthony's question and then we'll give a chance to Giulia to respond.
Hi, Giulia. Greetings from New York, where it's the middle of the night and the middle of winter.
Oh, thank you so much.
Kudos.
It's great to hear your about your fascinating book. It strikes me that obviously in our contemporary world, it's more or less a given that women have rights and are protected in the law, but we still are confronting this problem of misogyny, right? And I think that what your work is doing is uncovering some of the shapes of that enduring misogyny, even in the face of these institutional structures that seem to protect us. But my question is, it's also fascinating to me that your work also seems to be somewhat in the tradition of Nicole Laureau. But you're doing something somewhat different in that, she was emphasizing the appropriation or the inclusion of the feminine within the character or the model of the Greek hero. And you're almost sort of switching this around. But when you were talking about this question of meandering or fluctuation, it also occurred to me that I wonder what you had to say about the figure of the statesman in Plato, who is of course a weaver, who is appropriating that feminine techne of weaving in order to be the kurios in a sense. And I just wondered what you might think or how you might incorporate that figure into your analysis.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you very much.
Do you mind if we quickly take Anthony's question? So is that okay?
Yes.
I don't want him to miss out. Anthony?
Thank you for that. So my question's not entirely unrelated to the issue of misogyny. So I was fascinated by this idea of Aristotle sort of asserting the superiority of men over women in terms of thumos and taking Homer as a paradigm for that. And it got me thinking about the catalogue of heroes in Odyssey 11, where we hear about all of these sort of dead male souls and how they died in all various horrific ways. But for all of the heroines, it's always these terrible things happened to my sons, but I survived. And all these terrible things happened to my husband, and I survived. And all of these terrible things were depicted by the gods, and I survived. And I wonder to what extent we can envisage this sort of Homerico-Aristotelian conception of feminine virtue as basically the employment of strategies to survive male thumos. So ideas like, even weaving, bringing about consensus, obsequiousness, deploying devices are all ways of dealing with the reality of male violence and their fundamental incapacity from having less thumos for challenging them on that playing field.
Thank you very much. Well, it's true that I will start to reply to each of the questions, and then we'll see if there is a line of thought that brings them together. Plato. Thank you, Emma, for your question. More and more on female versus male and the possibilities of what Nicole would have called appropriation or of a redistribution of attributes. I am very keen on thinking of predication as distribution and redistribution, allotment and reallotment of properties and adjectives. So I think that Plato is all about that. And I think you're absolutely right. If there is a textual locus or a space of thinking, an horizon of thought in which that motion is continuous, that is Platonic thinking. And therefore, I really am grateful for your question, because it goes straight to something that is there as a potential extension of this writing, which is the difference of Plato and Aristotle on this point. It sounds like a banality, but very often you hear more, yes, how close Aristotle is to Plato. Now I would like to say the Antipodes. The Antipodes, because it's very useful if we start by looking at precisely the dissonance between the two. And that's exactly the point, Emma, you were making, because if we go with Plato, we are constantly metaphorizing the masculine with the feminine. We are in Plato's pharmacy. We are in the space in which there is no limit to precisely the transfer of meaning from one term to its opposite, and masculine, feminine work exactly as writing and voice, or body and soul. The soul is not the body. How do you describe the soul? As a body and as a pregnant body, and so on and so forth. So I think that motion, that back and forth, that metaphorane is really the trademark of Plato's thinking about the female and male, feminine and masculine. And I think that Aristotle, on the contrary, pushes a completely different project, which is taxonomic, which is understanding the difference among differences, and which is all about precisely trying to think clearly and neatly and distinctly, even though there can be also moments of tripping. One moment of tripping could be that when we read in the Poetics again, that the passions appropriate to the pleasure of tragedy are pity and fear, and we keep turning around. What is catharsis? Why pity and fear? What are the toyauta, pathemata, and so on and so forth? And then suddenly, I ask myself, but these two passions are hypergender. In Aristotle, you find places where if there are two passions that are typically feminine, these are fear and pity. So the best spectator of tragedy, from which we shouldn't have women, are women. So these are this moment of tripping of precisely, when the systematicity tries to be so consistent that it becomes a joke. So yes, in Plato, I would say more than ever, exactly what you are describing, this constant back and forth. But I would say in Plato more than in Aristotle as a way of thinking, speaking. And the question of the survival, well, men are mainly at a cost. I think that, something, Ben, you were drawing attention to the fact that the first chapter was on masculinity as an aspiration. Mm. And this is something in which I found myself discovering a cultural logic. Masculinity, we can see it as, of course, if we debunk, if we take a sort of simple ideological reading, we would say, oh, these are all rationalization of a superiority, of a violence, of a power, which is a giving, which is because you could say, in a sense, this is what they say, war is there, and therefore you need a certain kind of soldier. And therefore you need a certain kind of construction of an ethos, which is the ideal ethos. And therefore you idealize masculinity and courage, etc. But how do you go about doing it? And what I think Greek culture does is to transform that violence into a virtue. So, Andrea is not just basic instinct. Andrea is something that any moment terrifies you. And courage is precisely, as Aristotle would say, the capacity to endure fear for the sake of the beautiful, and the ability of having that famous energy, that famous thumos, that synergy, that comes in synergy and makes you go, because you can sit on your armchair and say, wonderful to die for the homeland, but you don't do it. You need to get there, and then you need to know. Now, I think that this sort of Homeric idea of taking up the risk of dying is precisely, in a sense, the moral grandness of masculinity, the cost of masculinity, and it in a sense, it is turned into the exclusion of women from this opportunity, this aspiration, these ambitions, this possibility of success, which makes of women survivors, because they do not participate in that struggle and that risk of life. So it's a bit, something that we find in Simone de Beauvoir, the idea that you construct a certain idea of masculinity, not just on an arbitrary distribution of privilege that would not be deserved. It's the opposite. The problem with the logic of, in a sense, the moral exclusion of women is that you attribute to men the capacity for that ambition, the capacity to be the people who can risk their life, and women are out of this game, which is terrible and which is return against women in terms of cowardice, in terms of softness, in terms of inability to stand and tolerate any form of pain, which is an absurdity, because if only people look at what giving birth, Nicole Leroux did, is you could certainly not say that women are soft. I mean, it's an absurd, preposterous thing to say, but the sort of the moral cultural construction is that men, yes, they do risk their life. And then they deserve to, in a sense, they deserve to be considered up to the task to risk their life for power. So struggle for recognition, in a sense. And women are out of it. So, left as, Aphrodite comes to the battlefield and she's told, go away because this is not your place. So she goes away. And so it's not a reply to your question, Anthony, is the sort of emphasis placed on your question. I think that there is a very profound and culturally compelling polarity there between women saying I survived and men actually being butchered. Yes. And this sense of, heroism, if you want to call it like this, is so much part of Athenian culture, including democratic culture as a form of collective aristocracy, to go back to what we said.
Can I ask one last question? Or Tristan, did you?
I did have a question, but
well, perhaps you.
Is that all right?
You can have the last question.
that's very kind. Thank
Can
you.
I just ask one quick thing?
We'll be here until 6, so that's great. Go.
Oh, well, okay. I asked that many questions.
You haven't.
I was going to ask a historical question and a Marxist question, in a sense.
Definitely hit till 6.
Catherine very rightly said that, in spite of Condorcet, we've followed a Rousseauian path all the way, and perhaps the dream, there is a kind of subterranean dream that it still wants to, right? A kind of amongst the alt-right that wants to return to that kind of regime. Do you think that the reason why the choice to stick with Rousseau instead of Condorcet was because really in the end, to give women political participation would be to destabilize a kind of property regime or property rights of private property. So in other words, the question is it a property regime in which women's reproductive capacity is controlled? Or to put it another way, that men form a kind of sexual ruling class who seek to control the means of reproduction in order to assert control over all that reproductive capacity implies about succession, property and citizenship and so on. So that goes, this is not just for Rousseau, but this goes right back to the ancient city as well. But I mean, look, maybe that can be a rhetorical question. Because
No. The short answer, I think, yes, with an admission of ignorance. In other words, the system of filiation and inheritance, both in titles, in transmission, for instance, of sovereignty, the Sally Clause, or the English monarchy functions very different from the French monarchy. Property laws are very different in Europe, and I looked a little bit to this aspect, and certainly I should do much more about that. But I think that there is a legal and also customary intricacy in the systems of transmission of property that makes, for me, difficult to reply to your question with a yes or with a no, because you can have all sorts of twists and turns, especially in the aristocratic context, on the rights of women. Lévi-Strauss would say we have to think in terms of not women and men, but families of givers of women and families of takers of women. So you can have a society in which there is prestige, not necessarily for the woman as an individual, but for the families who are givers of women. And therefore, there can be laws and mores that turn out to be at the advantage of the woman's family. See what I mean? The complexity here is
especially in antiquity as well.
As in antiquity, the epicleros situation is a sort of very astute, we were talking about that, the very astute way of reconciling the interests of different bits and pieces of the family, filiations versus collaterality. So I'm not able to reply
That's
properly
fine.
to your question. So yes, let's say.
I think, Tristan, you're very patient for 2 hours, not asking a question.
Thanks, Giulia. You alluded a couple of times to the somewhat awkward relationship that there is between natural law and human rights,
Yes.
as we've come to take them for granted. And yet it's also kind of awkward that a lot of the key figures in post-World War II discourse and deliberation and institutionalization of human rights were working very much in the tradition of natural law. So thinking of Charles Mallock and Jacques Maritain, who influenced Mallock, who didn't see any incongruence between natural law and human rights. So I just wondered whether you could elaborate on that at all, but also to ask you whether you see in Condorcet, who I know you're writing on at the moment, another way of conceiving human rights, which exits out of the natural law condition, or whether you see yet another set of sources for thinking more appropriately or more productively, more emancipatorily about human rights today.
Thank you. Challenging question, a great question. In principle, of course, we could say, in principle, when to go back to Condorcet, or to go back to the declaration of the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, you could say human is synonymous of natural. So you need a notion of universality as a given that is not precisely deserved or difference of discriminating, but there is a given in nature, and this is a right to dignity, right to education, right to not to be enslaved. So isn't it this way of thinking compatible with the idea of natural law, with the fact that we have self-evident, the very notion of self-evident normative principle, precepts that are reasonable, that we find ourselves if we think a little bit, and so on and so forth. So in principle, the answer is yes. But if we go and look at the sort of granular textuality of these arguments, you know, and we look at what is the content of lex naturalis for Thomas Aquinas, well, you have this sort of being and time I was talking about. And that means in order to preserve being over time, you need heterosexuality. And you must have heterosexuality, meaning that homosexuality is an aberration. You must have marriage. You must have sex, finalized to procreation, and you must have that complementarity, that asymmetry within the family that best suits the purpose of maintaining the world. So in principle, yes, natural law and natural right go together in a sense. It's the same logic. But in practice, natural law is all about duties, obligations, very precise forms of behaviors that are so much centered precisely on sexuality, as heterosexuality, on procreation, and on the asymmetry within the family. Now, you will tell me, why is this important? This difference between in principle and then this sort of specialized understanding of natural law. Well, it's important because first response, if we look at Condorcet for a second. When Condorcet speaks about rights, he's not talking about these things. He's talking about the right of every citizen and individual to feel safe, to feel protected, to be part of the confection of the laws, to be included, to be treated properly. So when Condorcet begins to talk about these elementary rights I was alluding to, it is all in your favor. It's really what we think as a right, as a claim, as a protected faculty. If we define a right as a protected faculty, it's a protected possibility. It's all in your favor. Read Thomas Aquinas and his friend, improbable friend, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's all about duties. It's all about what women must be. It's that, you know, you must be heterosexual. You must have children. You must have sex to have children. You must raise your children. And you must be a nurturing mother and not try to usurp the rights of the father, etc. So when you look at historically, that sort of compatibility is transformed into something that is awkward, but is actually an abysmal difference, an abysmal contrast. It's completely different perspective. And today, you know, you have in the United States really a very strong voice of natural law jurists and theorists of the law who are incredibly engaged, actively engaged on abortion, on gay marriage, on the right of women to deliberate and decide about their own bodies. And these people tell you, John Finnis, I have on the
Adrian Vermeulen.
excuse me.
Adrian Vermeulen. He's a major advocate.
A major advocate, and Haskins, Hadley Haskins, etc. These people, you know, tell you explicitly. Aristotle tells you what marriage is about. Thomas Aquinas tells you what marriage is about. You have to go back to Aristotle, to Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas. And precisely, I have a sentence that I had. If you give me 1 second.
You can have two.
I had prepared it. Yeah. On the question of gay marriage, John Harvey writes, who is one of these natural law advocates, there is something radically wrong in a culture that constantly claims rights without giving, without grounding them in natural law. So today it's a war. You know, when they say in the United States, a cultural war, this is the war. The war is natural law and Catholic members of the Supreme Court being very vocal on the one hand, and people who defend right. So today it's really a rift. But it's true that in principle, it's the same appeal to a given.
Essentializing notion of human nature.
It's essentializing, and it's this ground, this foundation. You know, God wants life. So when you have this pro-life, pro-choice, really, in a sense, that's the contest. Pro-life, natural life, natural law. So life with capital L has nothing to do with an existence, a form of life, liberty, as self-determination, have discovered form of affectivity that want to be durable, that want to be recognized, nothing to do. It's life as Thomas Aquinas wants it to be. And these people are incredibly powerful. So, you know, when we had Martha Nussbaum and others fighting on the famous Colorado law on the protection of minorities, of homosexuality, this is the debate. This is the discussion. That awkwardness, you were sorry. I mean, it's cultural war, as they say.
Yeah. I knew we were lucky to have Giulia join us, but after this conversation, I feel especially so. So really, huge thank you. Please join me in thanking Giulia.